Welcome to the latest addition to the Compliance Podcast Network, the podcast 10 for 10, which brings you the week's top 10 compliance stories curated together in one podcast each week. Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, brings you the compliance professional stories you need to be aware of at the end of your busy week. Sit back and in 10 minutes, hear about the stories every compliance professional should be aware of. Every Saturday, 10 for 10 highlights the most important news, insights, and analysis for the compliance professional, all curated by the voice of compliance, Tom Fox. Get your weekly filling of compliance stories with 10 for 10. Hosted by Tom Fox. 10 for 10 is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. Also, if you are looking for something new and different for the upcoming Compliance Week celebration in November, check out The Compliance Kids. It's my 3-book children's series on compliance and compliance professionals for children. But they make great gifts and great training tools for your employees. You can check it out on Amazon.com. We've linked to it in the show notes. First, a word from the sponsor of the Compliance Podcast Network for this month, Ethico.
If you're a compliance officer, middle managers are crucial in getting your programs from you to your frontline employees. But how do we activate those managers and get them on our side? Ethico's new Middle Manager Toolkit equips you with the skills needed to empower your managers, to promote a culture where ethical behavior thrives and employees feel empowered to speak up. Learn how to turn frontline managers into ethical leaders with our new white paper, Empowering Middle Managers as Ethics Champions. And did I mention you can get the whole toolkit for free? Head to ethico.com to download the full toolkit today.
10 for 10 for the week ending October 26, 2024. We begin with the story from the Wall Street Journal business section that former Abercrombie & Fitch CEO Mike Jeffries has been arrested and charged in a sex trafficking case. This was reported extensively by the BBC, so the story is not new, but now prosecutors have brought charges. Obviously, this is going to be a huge problem for Abercrombie & Fitch, who claim they had no knowledge of any of this, yet much of this happened, or at least some of it did, when he was still the CEO of the company. So we're going to be watching this story. Next up from NPR, Peru's former president Alejandro Toledo was sentenced to 20 years and 6 months in prison this week in a case involving corruption paid by the Brazilian construction giant Odebrecht, which became synonymous with corruption across Latin America, where Odebrecht paid millions of dollars in bribes to government officials. Authorities accused Toledo of accepting $35 million in bribes from Odebrecht in exchange for allowing construction of a highway in the South American country. Next up, and finally, a little justice has arrived for Tigran Gambaryan. He is a compliance officer at Binance who traveled to Nigeria earlier this year and was thrown in jail on a trumped-up charge. He has been in jail in Nigeria facing charges of money laundering and tax evasion since that time. However, a court ruled that the criminal charges against him would be dropped on medical grounds because of pressure from the United States. He was detained back in February and jailed after being invited to the country by Nigerian officials. Clearly a trumped-up charge, and whatever Binance may have done, it wasn't their compliance officers who were putting them in the deep end. You wonder what corruption's going to look like under the Trump administration or a second Trump administration? Well, we have the first hints of it as Trump has put forward Eileen Cannon, the judge who threw out the classified documents case, as a candidate for Attorney General. And if that's not a quid pro quo, I'm not sure what is, but it clearly portends how Trump will pay back his friends for actions that he deems in his interest. So Her name appeared also with former SEC Chairman Jay Clayton. So I think we will all see a horrendous amount of corruption if there is indeed a second Trump administration. Next up from the Wall Street Journal, Risk and Compliance Journal, Mingy Sun reporting that the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, has fined a California casino, over willful violations of AML regulations, its first enforcement action against a casino in 6 years. The California-based Elsinore Hotel and Casino agreed to pay $900,000 to settle allegations it failed to comply with the Bank Secrecy Act for more than 4.5 years. These violations included failure to implement and maintain an effective anti-money laundering program and failure to file currency reports and suspicious activities reports. We usually get better treatment by casinos, but not in this case. Next up, in a report from Unchained, it notes that Kamala Harris's transition team, should she win the election, is looking at 2 candidates to head the SEC to replace Gary Gensler, who are much more crypto-friendly. They are Chris Brummer, a Georgetown law professor, and Erica Williams, who's currently the chair of the PCAOB. They are much more favorable in their views on crypto than Gensler, so it would be clearly an outreach by the Harris administration to the crypto industry. Next up, the first of 2 stories from the Financial Times. EY fires staff who took multiple online training courses at once. I guess honesty, trust, doing business ethically and in compliance really are not a part of the EY culture, because if you have to take training courses and they're mandatory, you really shouldn't take multiple courses at the same time. Now, the terminated EY employees simply said, well, we're multitasking because we're that good. Well, horse hockey to that. If there's a training course you have to take that's going to be anything more than a check-the-box exercise, you really have to take it and pay attention to it. Our second story from the Financial Times reports on a new law to force UK employers to stop harassment before it starts. What does that sound like? Prevention. What are the 3 parts of a compliance program? Prevention, detection, and remediation. This week, all UK companies will have to take preventative action to stop sexual harassment before it starts. The new rules require employers to spot risk of a potential incident and then shut them down rather than acting afterwards. If you've ever worked or been around people that worked in the City of London, you recognize how difficult this will be. Next up from CoinDesk, it reports on the company Crypto.com, which has sued the Securities and Exchange Commission in a true bet the company case. What this is about is the company seeking a DEC action or declaratory judgment and injunctive relief to prevent the SEC from, quote, expanding its jurisdiction to cover the secondary market sales of certain tokens, i.e. securities. If you're like me, this is probably not news because cryptocurrency projects are being sued all the time. But here, Crypto.com actually bought land in a Trump-friendly right-wing judge venue so that they could bring this suit. So that's a lot of planning and a lot of sophistication around this bet the company claim. And our final story comes to us from the New York Times, the sidebar column, as a Georgetown law professor has argued that 5 rulings by the Supreme Court in recent years has allowed behavior that is, quote, sketchy as hell to become legal, i.e. this is the Supreme Court's evisceration of bribery and corruption laws. Remember now, if you give a politician something afterwards as a gratuity for a job well done in bribery and corruption, well, that's not corruption. Have a great weekend. 10 for 10 is a special production of the award-winning Compliance Podcast Network. As I mentioned at the start of this podcast, our network sponsor is Ethico, and they've got a great new service offering for you, a middle manager's toolkit. We've linked to it in the show notes, and it's available to you at no cost. Many companies struggle with getting information to middle managers, which allows them to be the first line of response in a speak-up culture. And Ethisphere has answered this challenge by putting together a middle manager's toolkit. Check it out in the show notes. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of 10 for 10. I hope you'll check out the newest podcast in the Compliance Podcast Network, the Compliance Tip of the Day. In Compliance Tip of the Day, I give a 5 to 8 minute summary of one tip that you can integrate into your compliance program or put together for greater compliance program efficiency.